speaking on an ILSS platform. I feel very close to ILSS, and over the years I've watched it grow, and one of the things that has really interested me and made me feel very good is the fact that more and more women are becoming part of it, not only as students, but also as faculty. So I think that's great. So thank you very much for asking me to do this. You know, the impact of COVID-19 on women. So the pandemic is a fairly recent phenomenon, and we are still learning about its impact, and things are changing every day. But there are some learnings that we can draw from other sorts of pandemics that have happened in the world. And I'm going to bring some of those to bear on what I say. There is a lot to be said. I shan't be able to cover it in the time that we have. So I'm going to focus on a few things. I'm going to start by talking about domestic violence, which has actually been a little bit in the news because more and more people have started to talk about it. And then I want to go on to talk about women workers, and within that to look a little bit at marginalized and vulnerable communities. And then I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which supply chains being disrupted are impacting women's lives. And finally, I want to look at the question of language and the language in which this pandemic is being described and spoken of, and what it does, what it means for women. And then I'll come, if there's time, a little bit to just what can we do? Because some of you have sent in questions and they relate to really asking what you think we can do, what can the state do, and all of that. And nobody has any real answers, but I think there are some things that we can actually begin with. So to start with domestic violence, so I want to begin with a statistic that possibly some of us are familiar with, which is that across the world, domestic violence or familial violence kills on an average 137 women in one day. So this is a pandemic which is bigger and of longer duration than any we have ever known, for which no vaccine has as yet been discovered, or even nor has an attempt been made to actually find one, and which governments across the world have found it really difficult to address and have not really had the political will to address this. So it was difficult to think that such a widespread and deeply spread phenomenon can actually become worse at a moment like this. But the truth is that it has, and we have reports from across the world which from different countries, let's say France and America, Malaysia, Indonesia, other places, China, which show that in the weeks when the pandemic started up, reports and lockdowns were imposed in different places, reports of domestic violence rose, reported cases rose, sometimes doubled, and so on. In India too, we have similar reports, but they are a little more mixed, because the National Commission for Women, among the earliest to bring to public attention the fact that they were getting increased number of calls for help and reports of domestic violence, also noted, as did other women's organizations, that the picture in India is a little more mixed. And it is mixed for very specific reasons. One of them is that in the lockdown, people are locked inside homes, and many of the women who are victims and or survivors of domestic abuse are locked in the same space as their abusers, as the people who possibly support those abusers. And it is very difficult in that kind of space to get out and report. How will you report? Who will you report to? In the family, the burden of care work, as we know from across the world, always falls on women in a much larger way than it does on men. And now it is only increased because women are in the home, so they are the ones who are having to look after the old, infirm, children, and very many other people in the house. Their burden of work has increased, so to find the time to report a case of domestic violence is the first difficulty. To find a method or a means to report it is the next, because how do you get private space to be able to talk about the person who is next to you and in a cramped space, who is there all the time, or even in an open space? There is no privacy to be able to report it. You can use your cell phone and report it, but statistics show that in India, only among women, only 39%, 38 or 39% of women have access to cell phones. And then you can't even step out. In the past, the community used to provide a place where you could at least vent your anger or share it with a friend. That option too is not available to you. And then if you do manage to somehow report it, there is nobody who can come and help you, because all the services, the 101, the 100 or 181, all the helplines, etc., most of them have been suspended. This is what pushed the National Commission for Women to create a new helpline recently so that they could take some complaints. But even for that helpline, they could not get a number, because buying a new number is something that is suspended at this time. So one of the first people in the National Commission had to give up one of her numbers, and it was used for that. So we don't really have a picture of how domestic violence is expanding, if it is at all, and what the numbers, etc., are. But going by the experience of past pandemics and going by the experience of what happens under lockdowns, and we have the example of Kashmir before us, and what happens in moments of conflict, it is quite clear that locked in cramped spaces without any outlet, 24/7, no access to the public space, no being away from each other, is resulting in increases in domestic violence and also increases in sexual activity, and also more increases on the lives of women. So that is one thing that I think we need to take account of. There are other things happening inside the home which are equally disturbing and which impact the lives of women. So for example, if you look at women like many of us who are listening to this, or women like me who live in our own homes, one of the questions that came to me was, how is it the impact of this differential? It is differential in the sense that while it is frustrating for us, while many of us may face violence, also while many of us may face an increased burden of work in our homes, but we at least have a space in our homes, we at least have our computers that we can work from. Poorer women don't really have this at all. Also, what is being noted is that there is from India a huge increase in accessing porn sites, and most of that is child porn. So what will that lead to inside homes where men and women are there with children, and most of the people who are accessing that porn are by and large men? So what will that mean for the children, and what are the things that women will then have to face? An associated issue that comes up with this is that in the early days, in the relief packages that people were delivering to people who were impoverished and rendered into poverty by the lockdown, they had not thought of the needs of women. So what was happening was that you were getting atta, dal, rice, oil, etc., but no menstrual hygiene products, no sanitary napkins. Now, in the lockdown, where will you go out to find these things? Now, actually, many NGOs and the Delhi government, for example, have taken it upon themselves to distribute sanitary napkins, and many women are manufacturing sanitary napkins, and these are being distributed in households for free. But the distribution network that takes them to households, and this is something I will come to in a minute, but the people who take them to households are informal working women who then have to walk and go house to house to hand these out, and who do not, they are mostly Asha and Anganwadi workers, who do not get the protective equipment that is needed, who have no transport, and who have to mostly walk. There is a story of an Asha worker this morning's Indian Express, where she talks about having to service 127 families, and therefore she meets 620 people. And without protective equipment, without even anything like a mask, she is made particularly vulnerable because of this. So that is an issue that is slowly getting addressed, but it is an issue that renders other women vulnerable, while the woman in the home may be receiving sanitary napkins. But other things that have not been thought of is that in the past, when women did have a little bit of access to the public space, so for example, if you look at women in villages, they needed to go out to defecate. It was an unhealthy thing because they had to wait till it was night, unlike men who could use the public space at any time. But for women, they had to wait till it was dark. And even then when they went out, because the dark was supposed to be safe, but when they went out, they were vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual attack, but at least they had a space to go to. Now they don't have that space. Inside houses where there are no toilets, what happens? Where will women go? We don't really know. And now they do not even have the external world to get rid of their menstrual waste. So how do women who cannot get out of the house dispose of used sanitary napkins? How do they wash cloth pads in non-existent water? What actually happens? These are all things that we need to think about. So in the realm of the domestic, I think that those are some of the points I'd like to put before you. Then I want to turn now to look at the issue of women and work. And as we know from statistics across the world, that care work, and I want to talk specifically about that a little bit, roughly about 92% of the care work across the world is done by women. In India, that statistic stands somewhere between 70 to 75% and includes the 900,000 ASHA workers, the ANMs, the Anganwadi workers, and other groups of women who are increasingly added to this list. And it's very interesting to see what they're named. They're called Mamtas, they're called Yashodas. And all of them are seen not really as workers, but as volunteers, which is what allows the state to underpay them much less than the minimum wage while extracting a huge amount of care work from them. Now that the midday meal scheme has moved from the schools and food has to be delivered to children at home, it is the Anganwadis and the ASHA workers who are delivering this food and are vulnerable and are having to travel. As I mentioned, the ASHA workers are having to deliver sanitary pads. A friend of mine told me a story of two ASHA workers in Guwahati in Assam who work with a PHC that she knows of, and who were asked to go and look up a suspected case of COVID in an apartment block. They had no protective equipment. They had to wait in the sun for 4 hours until some equipment could be reached to them so that they could enter the building and do their examination. It is also these same workers who are asked to go from house to collect information and to disseminate information. So they are increasingly vulnerable in this, and they get paid nothing for this, and there is no transport, so they have to go on foot, and sometimes they'll take rides from people, and those can be especially dangerous for them. Then let's look at the slightly more formal sector, where we are looking, say, at nurses who work in hospitals and nursing homes. There's been enough news in the papers in the last few days to show us that nurses nurses are the ones who are in touch with infected patients much more during the day than the doctor who makes a one-time visit. They are the ones who have to feed, clean, change the pipes, all of that. So they're constantly exposed, but they are the ones who don't have protective equipment. Not only that, but when they are given housing, so nurses at Jayaprakash Narayan Hospital recently complained that when the housing that they were given was a dentistry hall, and they had to share a bathroom between 9 of them. This is quite unlike what the doctors, who are both men and women, are given in 5-star hotels with individual bathrooms. So the nurses kept on asking for better protective equipment, better facilities, but nobody was really listening to them. And eventually their union had to raise a demand for this. Similarly, nurses in Jhansi had not been paid their salaries for 6 months, and they went on a one-day strike during the time of COVID to ask, to register their protest, and they were basically made to feel guilty for doing something wrong, something immoral in the time of an emergency. And their question was, isn't it immoral that we have not been paid? So ASHA workers, nurses, all of these people are particularly vulnerable at that time. But if you go further, you look at other vulnerable communities. So you look at the sanitation workers whose jobs are in the public sphere, as yet they have no protective equipment at all. The women who come to sweep in the area where I live now are all contract workers whose jobs are on the line, and they cannot not come back, but they Ask us, the people who live here, to give them some rumal or something to cover their faces. The municipality does not provide them with that because they don't think of them as important enough. Rag pickers and others, all of these people are out of jobs and in their homes and not earning anything much. Then there are trans people, and trans people, trans women particularly, their jobs are so public. They are begging at traffic lights. They do badhai, going from home to home. They do singing and dancing. They do sex work, just like other sex workers. And all of these things have stopped. Their livelihoods, their lifelines, all of these have dried up. And this is something that the state really needs to pay attention to. This is not a problem only for the here and now, because what happens, and we know this from what we know of disasters and wars and other such moments in world history, is that when jobs are scarce, when there is an economic shock, and when economies try to resume and people go back into work, it is largely the vulnerable who are left out. And that is largely women, also because employers see women as demanding, within quotes, too many concessions, for example, in terms of maternity leave and things like that. And therefore, they're reluctant to employ them. One of the questions that was sent to me was, what will this mean for young people in jobs? And I don't know if you've been reading how the big corporations who come to recruit students from colleges before the students pass out of especially the elite colleges, are now pulling back on employment. And it is anybody's guess who gets to lose in this. And I'm pretty sure that it will be the vulnerable communities. So in terms of work and jobs, that's another thing that we need to be really concerned about. Then I had said that I would talk about supply chains. And one of the interesting things about this crisis is that the manufacture of contraceptives across the world has almost, and manufacture of everything, but contraceptives in particular, which relates to this, has almost come to a halt. The larger quantity of the world's contraceptives are manufactured in Asia. Much of it is done in India. And the way the manufacture is done is that the raw materials for the contraceptives are sourced from X country. The production takes place in Y country. So India and China, for example, are very closely aligned in the manufacture of the contraceptive pill. And the raw materials of that are sourced from China, and India manufactures this. But with the lockdown and with the stopping of travel and with the stopping of communication and with the stopping of freight and all of that, this manufacture cannot take place. So supplies are drying up. The larger companies have completely closed down. I've heard that the largest company manufacturing IUDs in India has closed down. And there are stories from Iran where a supply of IUDs sent from somewhere has not been allowed to enter the country because of restrictions on transport. What does this mean? This means that there will be a shortage in supply of contraceptives, but it also means that chemists and others who are finding that people need medical emergency medicines much more are the ones who are, they're putting away these and trying not to sell them, and they're really not interested in things that they cannot increase the prices and so on. So this will have an impact on women's reproductive health. This will make for a lot of unprotected sex. That can lead to a lot of diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. And that's a scenario that can be really, really serious. And because services are suspended, because the reproductive and sexual health services until recently in a crisis like this were not declared as essential services, although now both the central and Delhi government have issued advisories that these should be seen as essential services. So pregnant and other women have somewhere to go to seek the advice, medical help, and things that they need. But earlier that was not the case. So if you wanted an abortion, which is a right in this country since 1971, you could not have it. And by the time the lockdown opens, it might be too late for you. And so what would that lead to? Many women going the way that 59% of our women already do, which is unsafe abortions performed by quacks in some hospitals somewhere. Now, even though the governments have issued advisories that maternal services, reproductive and sexual health services should be seen as essential services, it is an impossibility for women to find medical attention when they're ready to give birth. And there is a story of one woman who went from hospital to hospital, starting from Safdarjung and going to Jayaprakash Narayan Hospital, and nobody would take her until it was almost too late. And a women's group, Sama, has yesterday filed a petition in the courts saying that this order should really be implemented for the sake of the safety of women's bodies. Finally, I want to try to bring this to a close. Let me see. Yeah, I have about 6 or 7 minutes. I want to talk about the language in which we speak about these things. You know, in many ways, the language of social distancing is something that reinforces all the caste and class biases that we have in our society. Why we could not have called it physical distancing, I do not understand, because that is what it is about. We are not being anti-social, if you want to call it social distancing. We are just staying physically separate from each other because there is this technical thing that if you're within a certain distance from X or Y person, that person, the spray from that person's mouth might bring an infection to you, and you have to avoid that. But social distancing really sets up a kind of class division. And that is being played out by so many resident welfare associations and others who are, for example, keeping domestic workers away from the homes in which they work. Of course, it is difficult for domestic workers to come there during lockdown, but it is possible for those who live close to come to those houses, or even when they come to collect their salaries, they are not allowed to come in, so they have to live without that money. And who are these domestic workers? A lot of them are migrant labor. A lot of them are women who have come from Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, other places to seek domestic work. And many actually have been, within quotes, sold by their families, or when the agent comes to take them away, he gives the family some money, excuse me. And now these single women, they're mostly single, really have nowhere to go. They have no food to eat. They have no security. They cannot return to their homes. And I was quite struck that when the television channels started to look early at the migrant labor who was leaving their homes on the places where they work in large numbers, all the visuals were of men. And even my favorite program on television, which is NDTV's Prime Time by Ravish Kumar, when Ravish did the first 2 or 3 shows, he basically, all the visuals were of men and he only talked about men. And yet we know that huge numbers of women are in the informal sector. They all come from vulnerable communities. Many of them are Dalit, many of them are trans women, many of them are really poor women. Take the construction sector, for example. There are so many women in it, and we haven't even begun to recognize the fragility of their existence because they earn much less than the men. Their jobs are on the line all the time. They are subject to sexual attack all the time. And this situation is going to make life much worse for them. And it's going to make it much more difficult to come back into jobs that may be violent, but that are necessary for their survival. There are also stories that we are getting about widows who are not receiving their pensions, about women with disabilities whose carers are not able to come because of the lockdown, and about poorer women with disabilities who are starving, and about how widow pensions, which are supposed to be received by the widow herself, are often being accessed by men in their households, maybe sons, maybe brothers, from banks. How they're getting them out, we don't know. And whether or not they're passing them on to widows, we don't know that. So the language of social distancing, physical distancing is one thing, but also the language of war, the way this thing is being seen. It's a very misogynistic, very masculinistic language of war. This is a medical emergency. It's not a war. There is no front line. So we are talking about frontline people. There are no soldiers, but we are talking about soldiers. And add to this language, the language of our dominant culture in India, and you have the Lakshman Rekha. And the Lakshman Rekha is what pushes women right back deep into the household and imposes barriers on them to step out. And I think this is a very dangerous thing. I heard a doctor from New Zealand speak on television yesterday, and he said, you know, what the language of war does is that it sets up an enemy, is that it allows you to attack the other. It is that it creates anger in you. And this is not a time for anger. This is a time really for solidarity. And he linked the language of war to the kind of attacks on minority communities that were happening, and said that this is something that is very dangerous. And we see actually underneath what is going on, that the epidemic and the kinds of actions that are being taken by those in power, and particularly the police, is being used to silence dissent, to silence different kinds of speech. I'm sure you're aware of the young journalist from Kashmir who has been arrested for taking photographs of women in Kashmir whose husbands have died and disappeared, which is something that has been known for 30 years. It's been part of public attention for 30 years. So why can a young woman not carry out what is her work, and why is she subjected to arrest in this way? And here I think we also have to think about the minority population of Delhi, and particularly the women of Shaheen Bagh and other similar protests who sat out in the public space for 3 months in an exhausting and involving protest, where the public space became available for them, who were then subjected to the trauma, many of them, of losing people from their families in the attacks that took place in Northeast Delhi, and who are now locked inside their homes and facing all kinds of things inside their homes. So in a sense, it becomes the responsibility of society and the state, or the state and society, to address so many of these issues that are coming up. How can they do this? I'll just say a few words on this and then conclude. So when the lockdown started, a group of women activists wrote an open letter to the Chief Minister of Delhi, saying that it is your duty to protect the human rights of women and to cater to their needs during this lockdown. They listed a whole range of services that the state could provide, such as declaring reproductive and sexual health services as essential services, such as making sanitary pads available, such as making packages of relief given to single women, to vulnerable women, to trans people, and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of things they've outlined. Also, what they said was, the state should set aside a gender budget to look at the needs of women at times like this. And if you have not done it to start with, because you didn't think about it, do it now. Take out some money and look at the specific needs of women and address those. Otherwise, this thing is going to just go deeper in our society. And they also suggested long-term things, like giving women, ensuring that women scientists are trained up, and therefore that they play a role in research and so on, so that they also think really about women. So there are a whole range of things that states can do. And for those of you who wish to see this letter, which is really an interesting and very solid letter to the Chief Minister of Delhi, I'm happy to share it with you through ILSS. So I want to just end this by mentioning to you that, of course, all of this is very serious and very grim. And I want to remember at this stage 2 Indian women who, during the plague epidemic in India at the end of the 19th century, both worked with the people who had contracted the disease, both caught the disease, and both died from it. One of them was called Bhikaji Kama, and the other one was called Savitribai Phule. And Bhikaji Kama, because she was wealthy, was able to travel to England and get seek some medical attention and get some kind of cure. Savitribai Phule, because she worked with poor Dalit women and widows and so on, and did not have a lot of money, died from the disease in Maharashtra near Pune. And I think at this time, it is worth remembering those two women just as just because their histories are really important. And equally, I think it's worth remembering a woman called June Almeida, who in 1964 is said to have identified the coronavirus as the coronavirus, and she's the one who gave it its name. And that is something that is hardly ever recognized. So it's, while we talk of the ways in which women are impacted as a result of this lockdown and the pandemic and the state's policies that follow from the pandemic, I think let's also remember the women who actually did a lot and also lost their lives because of that. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to talk about those.
Great. Thank you so much, Urvashi. That was a very wonderful presentation. I mean, right from the caregivers to the vocabulary, it was overarching. So thank you for your analysis. May I request all of you to submit your questions, and we'll take them one by one. And I'll start with one of the questions that came, which people sent while registering. And this was a question about starting conversations about hierarchy and feminism in the house, because these are the times when families are together. And how would you advise young people who would want to start these conversations among their families about patriarchy, about about the discrimination, about the invisibilization of women? How would you advise them to start these conversations?
You know, I mean, there's no formula for this because these are not easy conversations, but sometimes actually we think they're more difficult than they are because we've never actually tried to talk. So if you are in the house, I would say one of the things to do would be to start a conversation with your mothers, to just talk to them about the work that they do, to talk to them about what it means for them, to talk to them about their dreams, whether they have ever actually wanted to get out of this, what did they sacrifice for it, and so on. I think that opens up many things. That kind of thing opens up many things. So that could be one way of doing it. From the stories that my students tell me, one of my students from Kashmir told me this really interesting story of how he went and talked to his father about the work that his mother does. So he watched his mother and counted the number of hours she spends every day on work, then multiplied them by the number of days that she had been married to his father. And then he took his father's salary and halved it to start the conversation, and then calculated if his mother had been paid half that salary, what would she have earned? And then he took that information to his father and began a conversation with his parents about the burden of work and the division of labor in the house, which it could be, I mean, I don't know if every parent can listen to this, but it could be an interesting way, because what is happening is that the division of labor is also getting more kind of entrenched in the house. And when things open up, will that be able to be changed? We don't know. The chances are that it will not, because this is an opportunity to push women back into the home.
Right. Wow, that was a very creative way. Urvashi, we've had many webinars in the past 1 month about pandemics, and one of the topics that has been raised time and again is domestic violence in the times of the pandemic and in the times of lockdown. And so there's a question around how can domestic violence be identified and how can it be addressed in a hyperlocal model, because obviously the incidents have increased.
So, you know, people in different countries have found different ways of doing that. For example, I believe, this is hearsay, I don't know, but I believe in France, for example, when you go out to shop at a supermarket for groceries and such like, they have a specific place where if you are facing domestic violence, you can leave a note or you can leave your name and address, and then they will see that they will come to see you. They should also, here in India, for example, one of the several things that are hampering the reporting of domestic violence, the helplines are not functioning. They should be fully functional at a time like this, so that at least those who can call the helpline can get some redress. Okay, the number you can dial for the police, many women are scared because the police have not created a sympathetic image of themselves. So they're fearful of reporting to the police. But even if those services that are in existence were functional, at least there would be something. But we don't even have that. Those services have been completely suspended.
Right, right. Another question is, how do you see the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown and the laying of or following of professionals on the women population, on budding professional women? Would they be on the first line when it comes to?
Yes. So I tried to address that when I mentioned how big corporates now are cutting back on employing young people, the jobs they have already offered. They're saying we'll have to see and we'll individually write to people to say who is getting the job and who's not. And the general, if we go by general patterns, then if employers are not bound to follow the ethics and rules of employing a diverse and inclusive population, they tend to always go for the least problematic. I'm using that within quotes. And the least problematic are often men, because they don't have the same kind of pressures and ties that women carry with them into jobs, which employers see as concessions they're making to women, but which are actually a social duty. You know, I mean, women wouldn't get pregnant without men, and they would, when they produce children, they're producing the new workforce. So they're not, you're not making concession to them. So the chances are that this will hit women harder, yes.
And how do you think the COVID-19 epidemic would impact the food security and financial security of women, especially those in rural India? There is a question which talks about the condition of women in Bundelkhand and other backward regions, which has deteriorated immensely because of the epidemic.
You
and
know,
what can be done to address these conditions?
Yeah. I think that's really important to look at, because if there is no livelihood, there is no food. And if there is no food, there is no security. And that is why many of the people working on the ground with poor women, like tea plantation workers and others, are asking for cash transfers. They're saying that there should be direct cash transfers to the women so that at least they have some money in their hands. That is why there is so much pressure on the government, and I do wish that they would give into it, to release and give away the stocks, 77 million tons of food grain stocks that are lying in the FDI godowns. And that will, you know, you need to clear space there for the new Rabi crop, which so you need to get that out anyway. And you have a population which is starving and which is needing food, and which has no money to get food because they have no jobs. So surely you can use it at a time like this. And in giving out that, single-headed, female-headed households, single women, they should be especially sought out, and their needs should be addressed. So there are ways in which also there are other people who have talked about, you know, self-help groups on the ground and how they are being impacted. I don't know enough about them, but lowering of interest rates for self-help groups and for the money loans they have to pay back, all of that could also help. So you need to ensure that there is food, you need to ensure that there is some kind of work. Now, in some places where the Manrega has restarted, poor women are able to go and earn a little bit of money. So that is also help, and you have to sort of kickstart that in a big way by putting money into that program.
Urvashi, how do you see the future of sex workers who are out of livelihood and because of the social distancing measures or the physical distancing measures, they, I mean, they would continue to lose their livelihood and most of them live on the margins of the society. How do you see their situation evolving?
So I think that their situation is going to be particularly bad because we don't know how long the lockdown will be. But even if the lockdown opens, I think the fear of contact will stay with people for a long time. The fear of physical contact will stay with people for a long time, and the fear of intimate physical contact will be even greater, and sex workers will be particularly affected, which is why we really need to start by addressing all the vulnerable communities. And when when you're talking about social distancing, this is what it does. It kind of reinforces that certain kinds of people are untouchable and you should keep away from them. Whereas this is a time to look at people in terms of their human rights and their livelihoods and what they need. And I think people like sex workers, like rag pickers, like sanitary workers, all of these people are the ones who should be, within quotes, the front line of receiving certain kind of security, certain kind of job insurance. All of those things could be done, but you have to have the political will to do that.
Urvashi, is this pandemic an opportunity to involve more women in the policy making process or bring more women, make them more visible in the public space? And how can we use this as an opportunity post the pandemic?
There are so many moments in our history which have offered great possibilities for involving more women in policy making. And in order to also ensure that women's needs and interests are taken care of, but they have been frittered away. And that opportunity has not been seized. So I think we can't think of a moment offering up that possibility without thinking of the will and the interest and to take that possibility, to open up a space for that possibility, and to actually understand that this is not a concession you're making to somebody. These are the building blocks of a healthy and inclusive society, and you have to do that. So, and you don't need to have a pandemic moment to do that. I mean, you see the experiment that Kerala did many, many years ago with the people's planning process at every level, where people came together to discuss what kind of state they wanted. And you see how it is paying off today in Kerala's health policies, in the way people have been involved in fighting the pandemic, in the way that many vulnerable communities, I mean, Kerala is the one state that actually made some relief available to, say, trans people. So many vulnerable communities are being seen as part of that community. In Kerala, the Kudumbashri program, which is made up of very marginalized women from marginalized communities, is the one that is now providing food to the whole state. So you don't need a pandemic to offer up that policy. You need the political will and the interest and the commitment to people as a resource for building a country, and not as people to marginalize and allow to starve or allow to die because they don't have formal jobs.
Urvashi, a lot of our audience is from the social sector, and there is a scare about funding being directed to COVID relief operations. And there's a question on what would you advise to organizations which are working in sexual health, reproductive health, maternal health, to make their case to the funders? How can they make better cases to their funders to retain funding in these times of crisis?
I think actually from what I understand or what I know of the ways in which many funders are working in this moment of crisis, whether they are corporates or whether they are international organizations funding NGOs and others, from what I can see, most of them are very alert to the altered needs of the moment in terms of funding. So I don't know if there is a withdrawal of funding that because it would be difficult to think of a funder who could not see the importance of funding maternal health, who could not see the importance of reproductive and sexual health services, who could not see the importance of all of these things which are part of this emergency, but which need to be addressed. So I don't have that same kind of fear. I don't know where it's coming from. If the questioner knows of certain instances where funding has been refused or something, then I think that maybe that might help us to understand. But as far as I know, I think funders are reasonably open to the new issues that the crisis is throwing up and redirecting or changing funding to suit that.
Urvashi, how do you see the impact of the epidemic on the feminist movement? Would we go back and square off the gains that we have made in the past couple of years? How do you see it panning out in the next couple of years?
Not at all. I don't think that that is going to happen. I think there is a very, very real fear that women, and especially poor, vulnerable women, but also middle class working women and others, will be pushed further back into the home, and it will become much more difficult for them to reclaim the space that we had fought for so hard and that women were gradually claiming and increasing. So I think that battle will have to be fought and will be fought because, once you've had something, when you start losing it, it becomes much more, you want to guard that thing and you don't want to lose that gain, so you fight for it. But as far as the women's movement and the feminist movement is concerned, that's why I mentioned to you that particular letter which women's groups had written. That letter was written very early on. And that letter is evidence of the deep ways in which women's groups had already, based on their knowledge of the past, anticipated what the threats to women's rights were going to be. So they were not defeated by this. They were concerned, they were thoughtful, they were proactive, they did what needed to be done. And today they are continuing to act in that way. They are the ones who are ensuring that relief takes into account women's needs. They are the ones who are filing petitions in the courts. They are the ones who got the state to agree to at least issue advisories on making maternal and reproductive health services essential services, or at least saying that they should be essential services. So they're not going to go away anywhere fast. I don't think there's any danger of that.
Staying on advocacy, Urvashi, there's a question on how can we, you spoke about how the ASHA workers, the A&M workers, they become more vulnerable in these times of crisis. What more can common people do to ensure that the voice? I mean, the government is made aware about these risks, and something is to be done about it.
See, the government is very well aware of these risks. It's not as if they don't know. ASHA workers and A&Ms and others are at risk just now. There's enough media reports and others for the state to know that this is happening. The state's attitude, and I say the state because it's not any one political party, but it is the state generally. This has been happening for a long time. Their attitude to these workers is that they are not real workers. They are volunteers, and they are called volunteers. But the work day that is extracted from them is often longer than an 8-hour working day that a formal sector worker does.
Right.
The salary that is paid to them and the other conditions of their work is paltry as compared to, it's not even the minimum wage. These women have been fighting for years, demanding increases in their wages, etc. And the state has not taken notice of this. Now, these are poor women. So they need the work. And that's what is being played upon. That is what is being traded off against their rights. But if you recognize them as women with rights, and if you recognize them as workers, that is important. The state is not doing it. I think people in society should at least understand that. Maybe we can together lobby for these workers to be recognized as workers. But we can't then stop at ASHA workers, because you have to recognize even the ways in which we are ignoring and not really taking seriously the disappearance of all the migrant labor, without whom our lives would not be possible. I mean, if there's no plumber, how do we live? If there's no electrician, how do we live? If there's no painter, how do we live? What do we do? So we are not even recognizing their value, the respect we should be giving them in our lives. And that's maybe, I mean, what if all of them refuse to come back and say, okay, the hell with you city dwellers, we are not going to come back and do your dirty work. We will all really then understand the value of their work. And I wish that for once they would do that, men and women, and then we'd be really in a mess and we wouldn't know what to do. But at least we would start respecting their work and paying them properly for it. So I think the responsibility is on us as well.
Right. Right. Urvashi, I would want to come back to conversations inside the house. And there's a question on how can we address the issue of domestic work being women's responsibility only in our houses? How do we start the narrative of the burden of domestic work being split equally between men and women?
The narrative has been ongoing for a long time. It has one of the big demands of the women's movement worldwide, big things on the agenda worldwide in every country has been, in one way or another, asking for wages for housework, or asking for housework to be recognized as an economic activity. And there has been, of course, huge resistance to it and ignorance of it. But I think in small ways, because the work that women do in the house, in the home, is taken so much for granted that I think in small ways, if we try to just start noticing even in our own lives, how we take the women who make our lives easier, how we take them for granted, or how we take our mothers for granted, who are the ones who toil all day. So, I like to think of myself as very liberal and somebody who understands and respects the people who work for me, etc., etc. But until these last 20 days, when I have been locked in my house and I have had to do everything myself, I never understood what the young woman who works for me as a domestic has to do every day of her life. And so she works in my house, but she works in her house also. And it is her income that supplements the family income, but she doesn't get that respect a lot from the family, because they see the husband's income as the real income for the family. But now I'm thinking, how does she do this? She works in 2 houses and she works in her home. That's 3 places. There are many women who work in 6 places.
Right.
So maybe this pandemic and the way we are thrown back on our own resources, us middle class lot, will make us realize the value of the services that we can so easily access. And now they are not going to be so easy for us to access.
Right. One last question, Urvashi. There's a question on how can we create collectives and feminist solidarities and sisterhood within homes and in the neighborhoods. How can we create circles of kindness, especially to support mental health? Are you aware of any such innovative circles coming up?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because really that creation of these kinds of circles of kindness or of friendships, this has been really the thing that has sustained women throughout. And I think that, networks like the Ashas, the Anganwadis, networks like the Sathins in Rajasthan, these are all networks, and even women's self-help groups, or even, for example, the organizations like the Women's Jamaat in Tamil Nadu and other places. These are organizations which are doing precisely what you're asking. They are organizations where women come together, and they come together to talk about their problems, or, for example, to pool their savings together. But once those organizations are formed and they acquire a life of their own, and often they become places where women are able to talk about things that they cannot otherwise articulate. This is why when I was talking about domestic violence, I was pointing to this, the loss of this kind of space because of the lockdown, as one of the really negative things. Because even if a woman facing domestic violence could not report it, or could not have her husband sent off or taught a lesson, or whatever it is, or she doesn't want to report it because it'll disrupt her household, or she cares for the man even though he beats her. But if she can go out and talk to her sakhis, or if she can go out and talk to her friends, it gives her an outlet. That precious space has been lost because of the lockdown, which really is a big loss, I think, for women. But such spaces do exist, and they are recreated afresh all the time, and they are really important to nurture, because that is one way where we can articulate the sort of things that we want to say.
One last question on mental health of during the times of these epidemics, especially for women, especially for marginalized sections. How do you see what impact do you see this epidemic would have on the mental health of sections? And do you see this as an opportunity to create these conversations about the importance of mental health?
Yes, absolutely. I think that conversations about the importance of mental health are absolutely essential to this time. And, we have so much evidence of what this kind of pressure does. So if you look at what's happened in Kashmir and the lockdown since August that has happened there, but even previously the endless curfews, you see that Kashmiri hospitals in Kashmir will tell you that the drugs that are most demanded are drugs for depression. And there are large numbers of women that come and ask for those drugs, because actually, with the loss of men, with the loss of young men to either they are disappeared, or they are become militants, or whatever it is, or they are killed on the streets, the burden of everything falls on the women. So it's a huge mental burden. And in our society, I think that we just don't give it enough attention. The psychological impact of facing this kind of trauma, we just don't give it enough attention. And we don't actually, when we start to give it attention, we don't often think of women, because they are also the last in line to receive medical attention and medical care. There is a very interesting piece in a recent issue of Frontline by, there's a psychiatrist at Sitaram Bhartiya called Alok Sareen, and it's co-authored with two other people. I can't remember the other names. And he is talking about this crisis and speculating on what the impact on the mental health of people could be of this. And he talks about how these traumas go very deep, and how difficult they are to deal with, because they are just kind of swallowed up and silenced. And for women, when you're not used to talking about yourself, how do you even articulate or find the words to say what has so deeply hurt you? And who will be there to listen? Because it's not only speaking it out, the important thing also is to have somebody to listen. And this has not happened. I mean, we never talked about the trauma of partition. Since I'm a partition scholar, we never discussed what that moment did to people in our country. I don't know how we are going to discuss what this did. And I'm sorry, one of the things I should have mentioned in the talk, which kind of links up with this, is I've talked about Kashmir, but you look at the racism that people from the Northeast are now being subjected to. Right. And how with women, the racist slurs are coupled with sexual insult. And that becomes very traumatic for them, because, just all of, they feel equally part of this country sometimes. Okay, if you're, you might not, also you might question it, but the fact is you don't want to be addressed in this way in a place that you see as your home or anywhere else. So that is also happening, and that's a pretty traumatic thing to deal with.
Right. We hope this epidemic makes the society ask itself these strong questions, which it has not asked to itself for a long time. Anyways, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us today, Urvashi. It's always a privilege and an honor to listen to you. It was a wonderful session, and I hope our audiences enjoyed it.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.